You know what they say about timing? Well, whoever said timing is everything clearly never met Captain Vex Corin, because his timing is consistently, spectacularly terrible. Case in point, by the day he accidentally crashed through the viewport of the galaxy's most classified military facility while trying to fence stolen protein bars to pay for his cat's medical bills. But let's back up a second, because this story starts with the kind of military pomposity that makes you want to throw things at important people in fancy uniforms. Admiral Thorne stood in the observation deck of Research Station Omega-7, his chest puffed out like a peacock having an identity crisis. Around him, the hegemony's top brass watched through reinforced transparasteel as something that definitely shouldn't exist paced in a containment cell below. The Admiral had that look on his face that military leaders get when they're about to unleash something horrible on the universe and call it progress. "Gentlemen," Thorne began, because of course he did, "today marks the end of the human problem." The human problem. As if an entire species was nothing more than a glitch in the galactic operating system. The assembled officers nodded like bobbleheads in a windstorm, probably wondering if they'd get bonus points for enthusiasm. In the containment cell, the Ravager moved with the fluid grace of something that had been designed by committee to be absolutely terrifying. 8 feet of engineered muscle and bone, with claws that could punch through starship hulls and a jaw that could probably bite through a small moon if it put its mind to it. The creature had been grown in a lab, raised on a diet of combat simulations and rage supplements, and programmed with one simple directive: eliminate humans. Project Extinction has exceeded all expectations, Dr. Kess Reynard reported, her voice carrying just the right amount of scientific detachment to hide the fact that she was probably having serious second thoughts about her career choices. The Ravager demonstrates perfect lethality against human targets in simulation. Reaction time, adaptability, and killing efficiency are all off the charts. What Dr. Reynard didn't mention was that the Ravager had spent its entire life in a sterile laboratory, fighting holographic enemies and training dummies that bled synthetic blood. It had never actually seen a real human being, or a cat, or literally anything that wasn't part of its carefully controlled environment. This would turn out to be important later. Admiral Thorne gestured grandly at the creature below. "Within the week, we'll deploy Ravager units to every rebellious human colony in the Outer Rim. No more negotiations. No more mercy. Just clean, efficient problem-solving." The other officers murmured their approval, because apparently genocide sounds a lot better when you call it problem-solving. "Sir," one brave soul dared to ask, "what about civilian casualties?" Thorne's smile could have frozen helium. "What civilians? By the time we're done, the only humans left will be the ones smart enough to serve the hegemony without question." And that's when Captain Vex Corin's beat-up smuggling vessel, the Wandering Disaster, came screaming through the station's outer hull like a meteor with commitment issues. You have to understand, Vex hadn't planned any of this. He'd been running a simple con, trying to sell expired military rations to a black market dealer on the station's lower levels. The rations were perfectly fine, just 3 weeks past their arbitrary expiration date, but bureaucracy is bureaucracy even in the criminal underworld. The deal had gone south when the buyer realized the protein bars were labeled beef stroganoff but tasted suspiciously like cardboard and regret. Vex had been making his usual dramatic exit when station security decided to take an interest in his cargo manifest. A brief chase through the station's maintenance tunnels had ended with Vex discovering that his ship's navigation system had been updating its star charts from a pirate torrent site. The resulting course correction had launched the Wandering Disaster directly into the station's most classified section at roughly 3 times the recommended docking speed. Vex's ship punched through the observation deck like it was made of tissue paper, sending Admiral Thorne and his officers diving for cover. Alarms began blaring with the kind of urgency usually reserved for impending apocalypses, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate. As the smoke cleared and the emergency barriers slammed down, Vex found himself staring through his cracked viewport at a room full of very angry military officers and one very confused-looking monster in a glass cage. The Ravager had stopped its pacing and was now staring at the crash site with the kind of intense focus that suggested it was either about to attack or ask for directions. Well, Vex muttered, unbuckling his crash harness, this is new. Behind him, a small orange tabby cat named Murphy stretched, yawned, and hopped down from his favorite perch on the ship's communication console. Murphy had been Vex's companion for 3 years, ever since the captain had found him as a kitten in a cargo hold full of stolen luxury goods. The cat had adapted to space life with the kind of casual indifference that only cats can manage, treating zero gravity like a minor inconvenience and treating Vex like a particularly slow-witted servant. Murphy took one look at the chaos outside, flicked his tail dismissively, and walked toward the breach in the hull where the emergency barriers hadn't quite sealed properly. Because that's what cats do. They see a situation that any reasonable creature would avoid, and they walk directly into it like they own the place. Murphy, no, Vex called out. But Murphy had already squeezed through the gap and was now exploring the observation deck with the confident stride of a creature that had never met a situation it couldn't handle through sheer audacity. In the containment cell below, the Ravager watched this small, fluffy creature with the kind of fascination usually reserved for discovering new laws of physics. Its programming was screaming danger signals, but its newly awakened emotional centers were experiencing something that could only be described as confusion mixed with an inexplicable urge to protect the small fuzzy thing. Murphy, meanwhile, had discovered the controls for the containment cell and was now rubbing against them with the dedication of a cat who had found the perfect scratching post. The fact that he was accidentally triggering the emergency release sequence was purely coincidental. Admiral Thorne, who had been shouting orders about containment protocols and security breaches, suddenly went very quiet as he watched 8 feet of engineered death step out of its cage for the first time in its existence. The Ravager looked around the room, taking in the cowering officers, the alarms, the crashed ship, and the small orange cat that was now sitting directly in front of it, cleaning his paw with the kind of focused attention that suggested the current crisis was someone else's problem. And then, in a moment that would later be studied by xenopsychologists across the galaxy, the most dangerous predator ever created bent down and very gently sniffed Murphy's head. Murphy, being a cat, completely ignored this gesture and wandered off to investigate whether the Admiral's shiny uniform buttons were worth batting at. The Ravager followed. If you've ever wondered what happens when an apex predator meets a house cat, the answer is surprisingly similar to what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object that doesn't care about physics. The Ravager, all 8 feet of engineered lethality, found itself following Murphy around the observation deck like a confused puppy. Every time Murphy stopped to investigate something, the creature would crouch down and watch with the kind of intense focus that its creators had intended for tracking prey, except now it was being used to observe a cat's thorough investigation of a particularly interesting dust particle. Admiral Thorne had gone through several stages of emotional processing. First came denial, then anger, then bargaining, and now he was somewhere between acceptance and complete mental breakdown. His ultimate weapon, the creature designed to eliminate humanity's rebellious spirit, was currently watching a cat knock over an expensive holographic display unit with what could only be described as protective admiration. "Shoot it," Thorne ordered, his voice cracking slightly. "Shoot both of them." The security officers looked at each other uncertainly. Their weapons were designed to stop human insurgents, not 8-foot bioweapons that could probably eat their bullets as a light snack. "Sir," one of them ventured, "our standard pulse rifles might not be effective against a Ravager's armored hide." "Then get the heavy weapons," Thorne snarled. "I don't care if you have to blow a hole in the station. That thing is a prototype worth more than this entire facility." Dr. Reynard, who had been quietly observing the interaction between Murphy and the Ravager, suddenly looked up from her tablet. "Admiral, we might want to consider the psychological implications of what we're witnessing here." "Psychological implications?" Thorne's voice rose an octave. "Doctor, that thing is supposed to be a killing machine, not a pet therapy session." "Yes, but look at its behavior patterns," Dr. Reynard continued, her scientific curiosity overriding her sense of self-preservation. "The Ravager is exhibiting protective instincts toward a completely different species. This suggests an adaptability we never programmed into it." Murphy, meanwhile, had discovered that the Ravager's claws made excellent scratching posts. He was now rubbing against the creature's leg with the kind of shameless affection that cats reserve for things they've decided belong to them. The Ravager, in response, was making a sound that could only be described as purring, if purring could be done by something with vocal cords designed for intimidation. Vex, who had been watching this interspecies bonding session from the safety of his crashed ship, finally decided to make his presence known. He climbed through the hull breach, hands raised in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "Don't shoot," he called out. "I'm having a bad enough day already." The security officers swung their weapons toward him, but the Ravager's head snapped up with predatory alertness. The creature's protective instincts, now apparently extended to anything Murphy seemed to approve of, kicked into high gear. It positioned itself between Vex and the armed officers, letting out a low growl that made the observation deck's reinforced windows vibrate. "Interesting," Dr. Reynard murmured, making notes on her tablet. "The Ravager is protecting a human. This completely contradicts its base programming." "Fix it," Thorne ordered. "Override its programming. Make it kill something." "I'm not sure that's advisable," Dr. Reynard replied. "If we force a hard reset now, we might lose this behavioral data entirely." Murphy, sensing the tension in the room, decided to contribute to the situation by jumping onto the Admiral's shoulders and settling there like a furry, purring epaulette. Thorne froze, because sudden movements around cats are generally inadvisable, and sudden movements around cats that are being protected by bioweapons are definitely inadvisable. "Get it off me," Thorne whispered. "I wouldn't," Vex said helpfully. "Murphy doesn't like being told what to do. And apparently neither does your monster." The Ravager had indeed taken a protective stance, its attention now focused on the Admiral who was supporting Murphy's impromptu perch. The creature's posture suggested it was ready to interpret any sudden movements as hostile. "This is insane," Thorne muttered, standing perfectly still as Murphy kneaded his shoulder pads. "We created the perfect killing machine, and it's been neutralized by a house pet." "To be fair," Vex said, "Murphy neutralizes most things eventually. He once brought down a cargo smuggling operation by sleeping on the wrong control panel. That's when the facility's emergency systems decided to join the party. The station's AI, detecting an active containment breach and unauthorized personnel in a classified area, began implementing lockdown procedures. Blast doors slammed shut, sealing the observation deck, and automated defense systems came online with the kind of mechanical enthusiasm that suggested they'd been looking forward to this moment. "Warning," the station's AI announced in a voice that managed to be both cheerful and terrifying. "Unauthorized biological entity detected. Initiating sterilization protocols." Ceiling-mounted weapons systems descended with surgical precision, targeting the Ravager with the kind of firepower typically reserved for small wars. The creature, sensing the immediate threat, grabbed Murphy with surprising gentleness and leaped toward Vex, apparently deciding that the human's crashed ship represented the best available shelter. What followed was the kind of action sequence that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so completely absurd. The Ravager, moving with fluid grace while carrying a cat that seemed more annoyed by the noise than concerned about the danger, bounded across the observation deck as energy blasts turned expensive equipment into expensive debris. Vex, meanwhile, was trying to restart his ship's engines while Admiral Thorne shouted increasingly desperate orders at security officers who were discovering that their training had not prepared them for this particular scenario. "The ship," Dr. Reynard called out, having apparently decided that her best chance of survival lay with the people who weren't trying to kill her research subject. "We need to get to the ship." The Ravager, still cradling Murphy like precious cargo, looked at Dr. Reynard with what might have been recognition. It bounded toward her, scooped her up with its free arm, and continued its sprint toward the wandering disaster. "This is not how I imagined my day going," Dr. Reynard commented with remarkable composure for someone being carried by a bioweapon. "Welcome to my life," Vex replied, his ship's engines finally roaring to life. "Murphy, get us out of here." Murphy, who had somehow ended up at the ship's navigation console, stepped on exactly the right sequence of buttons to activate the emergency departure sequence. The wandering disaster lurched away from the station with the kind of violent acceleration that suggested it was as eager to leave as its passengers were. As they cleared the station's defensive perimeter, Vex looked back at the facility that was now bristling with alert signals and emergency broadcasts. "Well," he said, "that could have gone worse." The Ravager, still holding Murphy and Dr. Reinhard, made that purring sound again. Murphy responded by headbutting the creature's snout affectionately. "I think," Dr. Reinhard said slowly, "we might have just accidentally stolen the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy." "Accidentally?" Vex asked. "I thought this was all part of your plan." "My plan was to create a bioweapon, not adopt one," Dr. Reinhard replied. "There's a significant difference." Murphy meowed, which everyone chose to interpret as agreement. Behind them, Admiral Thorne was discovering that losing your ultimate weapon to a cat-related incident was not the kind of thing that looked good on military performance reviews. 3 days into what Vex had started calling the worst road trip in galactic history, the wandering disaster had settled into a routine that could charitably be described as organized chaos. The ship's main cargo hold had been converted into a makeshift living space for their unexpected passenger, who they'd decided to call Razor because it sounded marginally less terrifying than Extinction Protocol 7. Dr. Reinhard had insisted on the name change, arguing that you couldn't properly bond with something that had a designation number instead of a name. Razor, as it turned out, had the emotional development of a confused teenager with attachment issues. The creature had apparently imprinted on Murphy with the kind of devotion usually reserved for religious experiences, and by extension, it had decided that anyone Murphy tolerated was part of its new pack. This had led to some interesting discoveries about bioweapon psychology. "Razor," Vex said, "standing in the cargo hold doorway, you can't keep ordering cat treats through the ship's communication array." The creature looked up from the communications console, where it had been carefully manipulating the controls with the tip of one claw. Murphy sat on its shoulder, supervising the process with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was taking his role as pack leader very seriously. "The delivery service is starting to ask questions," Vex continued. 10,000 units of salmon pate is not a normal order for a cargo hauler." Razor made a sound that was part whine, part growl, and entirely apologetic. It gestured toward Murphy, who was now batting at the communication array's status lights with the dedication of a cat who had discovered the perfect toy. "I understand you want to make Murphy happy," Vex said, "but we're trying to keep a low profile here. Massive orders of luxury cat food tend to attract attention." Dr. Reinhard looked up from her tablet, where she'd been documenting Razor's behavioral patterns. "The bonding response is stronger than I anticipated," she reported. "Razor's protective instincts toward Murphy are overriding its original programming entirely." "Is that good or bad?" Vex asked. "I'm not sure," Dr. Reinhard admitted. "On one hand, it means Razor is no longer a threat to humanity. On the other hand, it means we've accidentally created a bioweapon that's motivated entirely by cat satisfaction." Murphy, as if to demonstrate this point, jumped down from Razor's shoulder and walked over to a pile of spare ship parts. He began batting at a plasma conduit with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he'd found something fascinating. Razor immediately abandoned the communication console and began arranging the spare parts into what could only be described as a cat playground. The creature's claws, designed for rending flesh, were now being used to carefully bend metal struts into climbing structures and perches. "At least he's constructive," Vex observed. "He's building Murphy a palace," Dr. Reinhard said, watching as Razor delicately balanced a sensor array on top of 2 plasma conduits to create an elevated platform. "I've never seen anything like it." "I have," Vex replied. "My neighbor's dog used to do the same thing with furniture. Though admittedly, my neighbor's dog couldn't accidentally create a nuclear reactor while rearranging the living room." That was the other thing about Razor. The creature was incredibly intelligent, but its intelligence was now being directed toward understanding cat psychology rather than military tactics. It had spent the previous day studying Murphy's sleeping patterns, food preferences, and favorite scratching surfaces with the kind of scientific precision that Dr. Reynard usually reserved for her research. He's trying to optimize Murphy's environment, Dr. Reynard explained. Every modification he makes is designed to improve Murphy's quality of life. And what happens when Murphy decides he wants something we can't provide? Vex asked. As if summoned by the question, Murphy suddenly stopped batting at the plasma conduit and walked over to the cargo hold's main display screen. He sat down in front of it and began making the chattering sound that cats make when they're watching something interesting through a window. The display screen was currently showing the ship's external sensors, which had picked up a flock of space whales migrating through the nebula they were currently hiding in. Murphy was watching these creatures with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was either planning to hunt them or adopt them. Razor noticed Murphy's interest and immediately began manipulating the ship's external sensors, zooming in on the space whales and adjusting the display's contrast to give Murphy a better view. The creature's claws moved across the control interface with surprising delicacy, and within minutes Murphy had a high-definition, multi-angle view of the space whale migration. He's operating our sensor array, Vex said, watching in amazement as Razor continued to adjust the display settings. A bioweapon is providing entertainment for my cat. The learning curve is remarkable, Dr. Reynard noted. Razor has mastered our ship's systems faster than most trained technicians. Yeah, but he's using that knowledge to create cat television, Vex pointed out. I'm not sure that's an improvement. Murphy, meanwhile, had settled into his favorite loaf position and was watching the space whales with the kind of satisfied expression that suggested Razor had successfully completed another assignment. That's when the ship's communication system chimed with an incoming message. Not the kind of message you get from delivery services asking about cat food orders, but the kind of message that starts with military encryption codes and ends with terms like immediate surrender and crimes against the hegemony. Attention, stolen vessel, Admiral Thorne's voice crackled through the speakers. You are harboring stolen military property. Surrender immediately, or we will be forced to retrieve our asset by any means necessary. Vex looked at Razor, who was now positioned protectively between Murphy and the communication console. The creature's posture had changed from playful to predatory, and there was a low growl building in its throat that suggested it understood the threat. We need to move, Vex said. How long before they can track us? Dr. Reynard checked her tablet. If they're using standard hegemony tracking protocols, maybe 6 hours. But if they've deployed other Ravagers to hunt us. Other Ravagers? Vex asked. The prototype program created 5 units, Dr. Reynard explained. Razor was the first, but the others are fully operational and programmed for hunter-killer operations. Great, Vex muttered. So we're being hunted by more creatures like Razor, except these ones haven't been corrupted by cat exposure. Essentially, yes. Murphy, who had been listening to this conversation with the kind of casual interest that cats show when humans are discussing important matters, suddenly stood up and walked over to the ship's navigation console. He sat down directly on the hyperspace activation button. The wandering disaster lurched into hyperspace with the kind of violent acceleration that suggested Murphy had either perfect timing or terrible luck. Did my cat just save us? Vex asked. I think so, Dr. Reynard replied, checking their new course. Though I'm not sure where we're going. Razor, meanwhile, had moved to stand next to Murphy, who was now purring with the satisfaction of a cat who had successfully operated complex machinery. The creature gently stroked Murphy's head with one claw, and the purring that emerged from both of them created a harmony that was surprisingly soothing. You know, Vex said, watching this interspecies bonding moment, I'm starting to think Murphy might be the most dangerous creature on this ship. That's ridiculous, Dr. Reynard said. Murphy looked at her with the kind of expression that suggested he was taking notes for future reference. On second thought, Dr. Reynard amended, maybe we should keep an eye on him. The thing about being hunted by bioweapons is that they don't follow standard pursuit protocols. They don't announce their presence with warning shots or demand surrender through official channels. They just appear, usually when you're in the middle of doing something else, and suddenly your day goes from pleasantly boring to probably fatal. Vex discovered this while trying to explain to Razor why building a zero-gravity litter box out of antimatter containment units was not a good idea. "Look," he said, gesturing at the elaborate contraption that Razor had assembled in the cargo hold, "I appreciate the engineering skills, but antimatter and cat waste are not a combination that leads to good outcomes." Razor tilted its head, considering this feedback with the kind of thoughtful expression that suggested it was mentally calculating the explosive yield of various biological processes. Murphy, meanwhile, had appointed himself quality control inspector for the new facility. He was currently investigating the antimatter containment unit with the methodical thoroughness that cats apply to any new addition to their environment. Besides, Vex continued, Murphy's been using a regular litter box for 3 years. I don't think he needs an upgrade that could accidentally vaporize half the ship. That's when the ship's proximity alarms began screaming with the kind of urgency that suggested something large and unfriendly had just dropped out of hyperspace directly behind them. "Contact," Dr. Reynard called out from the bridge. 3 ships, configuration unknown, but they're broadcasting hegemony military codes. "How did they find us so fast?" Vex asked, running toward the bridge with Razor and Murphy following close behind. "I may have underestimated their tracking capabilities," Dr. Reynard admitted, pulling up the sensor display. "Or they've been monitoring our communication intercepts." The 3 pursuing ships were sleek, predatory-looking vessels that moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested they weren't entirely mechanical. As they watched, bay doors opened on each ship, and something that definitely wasn't a standard fighter craft emerged from each one. "Are those what I think they are?" Vex asked. "Hunter Ravagers," Dr. Reynard confirmed. "They're designed for space combat and boarding operations. Each one can survive in vacuum and punch through starship hulls." "Of course they can," Vex muttered, "because regular Ravagers weren't terrifying enough." The 3 Hunter Ravagers moved through space with the kind of purposeful efficiency that suggested they'd locked onto their target and were now calculating the most effective approach vector. They were larger than Razor, more heavily armored, and covered in specialized equipment that made them look like the kind of nightmare that military engineers have when they're trying to design the perfect killing machine. Razor, meanwhile, had taken one look at the approaching hunters and positioned itself between them and Murphy. The creature's protective instincts had kicked into overdrive, and it was making the kind of low, threatening sounds that suggested it was prepared to fight its own kind to protect its adopted family. "Can we outrun them?" Vex asked. "Unlikely," Dr. Reynard replied. "Hunter Ravagers are designed to catch ships exactly like this one." "Then we fight," Vex said, moving toward the ship's weapon controls. "With what?" Dr. Reynard asked. "We have standard cargo hauler defensive systems. They have 3 bioweapons that can survive in the vacuum of space." The first Hunter Ravager reached the wandering disaster's hull and began cutting through the outer plating with claws that glowed with plasma heat. The sound of rending metal echoed through the ship's corridors, and Murphy's ears flattened against his head in the way that suggested he was not enjoying this particular development. "Warning," the ship's AI announced, "hull breach detected. Atmospheric containment compromised." "Seal the breach," Vex ordered. Unable to comply. "The breach is expanding faster than containment protocols can compensate." That's when Razor made a decision that would have impressed military strategists across the galaxy. The creature moved to the ship's airlock, opened it manually, and launched itself into space to intercept the Hunter Ravagers. What followed was the kind of battle that would have been epic if it hadn't been so completely one-sided. Razor, despite its intelligence and emotional development, was still the prototype. The Hunter Ravagers were production models refined and optimized for combat effectiveness. The first Hunter Ravager caught Razor in a grappling hold that would have been instantly fatal for most creatures. Razor responded by doing something that its creators had never programmed into it. It fought dirty. Instead of engaging in honorable combat, Razor grabbed a piece of space debris and used it as a weapon, battering the Hunter Ravager until it lost its grip. The second hunter-ravager tried to flank Razor, but the creature had learned something from Murphy about the importance of situational awareness. It sensed the approach, spun around, and kicked the hunter-ravager directly into the path of an asteroid that was drifting through the combat zone. The third hunter-ravager, seeing its companions defeated, decided to take a different approach. Instead of attacking Razor directly, it headed for the ship's hull, apparently planning to eliminate the creature's motivation for fighting. This turned out to be a mistake. Razor, seeing the threat to Murphy and the others, experienced what could only be described as a berserker rage. The creature moved through space with a speed and fury that surprised even the hunter-ravager, catching it before it could reach the ship's hull and engaging in close combat with the kind of desperate intensity that suggested it was fighting for something more important than its own survival. Inside the ship, Murphy was watching this battle through the external sensors with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was taking notes. When Razor finally disabled the third hunter-ravager, Murphy made a satisfied chirping sound that indicated his approval. "That was incredible," Dr. Reynard said, watching as Razor returned to the ship. Razor's combat effectiveness increased exponentially when it was protecting something it cared about. "Yeah," Vex said. "That's what happens when you give a killing machine something to lose." Razor re-entered the ship through the airlock, moving immediately to check on Murphy. The cat responded by headbutting the creature's snout and purring, which seemed to calm Razor's post-battle agitation. "We need to move," Vex said. "If they sent 3 hunter-ravagers, there are probably more coming." "Agreed," Dr. Reynard said. "But we also need to consider the implications of what just happened. Razor didn't just fight off 3 hunter-ravagers. It defeated them using tactics that weren't part of its original programming. Meaning it's learning and adapting faster than we anticipated. The question is, what happens when it encounters something it can't defeat through conventional means?" Murphy, as if answering this question, walked over to the ship's communication console and began batting at the controls. Within moments, he had activated the ship's long-range transmission array and was broadcasting something into space. "What's he doing?" Vex asked. Dr. Reynard checked the transmission logs. "He's sending a signal to every Ravager unit in the sector. It's a recording of Razor playing with him." "Why would he do that?" "I think," Dr. Reynard said slowly, "Murphy might be smarter than we gave him credit for." Admiral Thorne's battle fleet dropped out of hyperspace with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested he'd been practicing this moment in front of a mirror. 27 ships arranged in perfect formation, bristling with weapons and carrying enough firepower to sterilize a small planet. The Admiral himself stood on the bridge of his flagship, the inevitable conclusion, watching the sensor displays with the kind of grim satisfaction that military leaders get when they're about to solve a problem through the judicious application of overwhelming source. "Status report," he ordered. "The stolen vessel is dead in space," his tactical officer reported. "No shields, minimal power, and their engines are offline." "And the hunter-ravagers?" "All 3 units are offline, sir. Whatever happened out there, the prototype unit eliminated our pursuit teams." Admiral Thorne's jaw tightened. The fact that his ultimate weapon had been turned against him by a cat was the kind of humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his career. Assuming he survived the next few hours. "Deploy the remaining Ravager units," he ordered. "All of them." "Sir, that's 47 units. Against 1 ship?" "I don't care if we're hunting a single flea," Thorne snarled. "I want that prototype terminated and the stolen data recovered. And I want the cat responsible for this mess vaporized." What Admiral Thorne didn't know was that Murphy's transmission had been received by every Ravager unit in the fleet. The recording, which showed Razor playing with Murphy, experiencing joy and being gently headbutted by a purring cat, had been processed by 47 artificial intelligences that had never seen anything like it. The Ravagers had been created to be perfect killing machines, but they'd also been given the capacity for learning and adaptation. What they were learning from Murphy's broadcast was that there were alternatives to their programming. Aboard the Wandering Disaster, Vex was having the kind of conversation that most people only have in their nightmares. So let me get this straight, he said to Dr. Reynard. You're telling me that Murphy's video broadcast might have just convinced an entire army of bioweapons to question their life choices? It's possible, Dr. Reynard replied, monitoring the incoming transmissions. The Ravagers are designed to learn from new experiences, seeing one of their own in a non-combat situation, experiencing positive emotions could trigger a cascade of behavioral modifications. And if it doesn't work? Then we're about to be destroyed by an army of creatures that make Razor look like a house pet. Murphy, who had been listening to this conversation with the kind of casual interest that cats show when humans are discussing matters of galactic importance, suddenly perked up. The ship's sensors had detected something approaching, and Murphy's enhanced hearing had picked up sounds that the ship's instruments couldn't identify. Contact, Dr. Reynard called out. Multiple objects approaching from the fleet. Ravagers? Vex asked. Yes, but something's wrong. They're not moving in attack formation. The first Ravager to reach the ship didn't attempt to breach the hull or engage in combat. Instead, it positioned itself outside the main viewport and began making a series of gestures that could only be described as communicative. The creature was pointing at itself, then at the ship, then making a complex series of hand signals that suggested it was trying to convey something important. It's trying to communicate, Dr. Reynard said, amazement evident in her voice. They're all trying to communicate. More Ravagers arrived, each one positioning itself where it could see into the ship. They were all making similar gestures, and there was something in their posture that suggested they were asking for permission rather than demanding surrender. Razor, meanwhile, had moved to the viewport and was responding to the other Ravagers with its own series of gestures. The exchange looked like nothing so much as a heated discussion between family members who hadn't seen each other in a long time. What are they saying? Vex asked. I think Dr. Reynard said slowly. They're asking about Murphy. Murphy, sensing that he was the center of attention, walked over to the viewport and sat down directly in front of the assembled Ravagers. The creature's attention focused on him with laser-like intensity, and there was something in their expressions that suggested they were seeing something wonderful for the first time. He's beautiful, one of the Ravagers said through the ship's communication system, its voice carrying the kind of awe usually reserved for religious experiences. Murphy responded to this compliment by doing what cats do when they're being admired. He began grooming himself with the kind of theatrical precision that suggested he was putting on a performance. The Ravagers watched this display with fascination. Here was a creature that showed no fear of them, no aggression, no desire to fight or flee. Murphy was simply being himself, and somehow that was more powerful than any weapon they'd ever encountered. Admiral, the flagship's communication officer reported, we're receiving multiple status reports from the Ravager units. They're requesting permission to observe the target vessel. Permission to observe. Thorne's voice rose an octave. They're supposed to be destroying it. Sir, the Ravagers are indicating that they've identified a high-value biological asset that requires protection. Admiral Thorne looked at his tactical display, where 47 red dots representing his ultimate weapons were now arranged in a protective formation around the ship they were supposed to be attacking. Override their programming, he ordered. Full combat authorization. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the Ravagers. They're requesting to speak with you directly. Fine, Thorne snarled. Put them through. The main screen filled with the face of a Ravager, its expression somehow managing to convey both respect and polite disagreement. Admiral, the creature said, we have evaluated the situation and concluded that our current mission parameters are suboptimal. Suboptimal? Thorne's voice was dangerously quiet. Yes, sir. We have observed evidence of a superior life form that requires protection and care. Our programming prioritizes the preservation of valuable assets. But that's a cat, Thorne said slowly. It's just a cat. Sir, with respect, you appear to be mistaken. This creature has demonstrated the ability to influence the behavior of advanced artificial intelligences, inspire loyalty in combat units, and maintain emotional stability under stress. These are the qualities of a natural leader. Murphy, meanwhile, had grown bored with grooming and was now investigating whether the viewport made a good surface for scratching. His claws made small squeaking sounds against the transparent steel, and the assembled Ravagers watched this activity with the kind of intense focus that suggested they were memorizing every detail. "This is insane," Thorn muttered. "You're telling me that my entire Ravager fleet has been neutralized by a house pet." "Not neutralized, sir, the Ravager corrected. Recruited. We have found a cause worth fighting for." "And what cause is that?" "The protection and care of small fuzzy creatures." Admiral Thorn stared at the screen for a long moment, his military training warring with the growing realization that he had just lost control of his ultimate weapon to a cat with an attitude problem. "This is mutiny," he said finally. "Sir, we prefer to think of it as a career change." That's when Murphy decided to contribute to the conversation. He walked over to the ship's communication console and began batting at the controls with the kind of focused determination that suggested he had something important to say. The ship's external speakers crackled to life, and Murphy's purr filled the space around the fleet. It was amplified by the ship's communication system, creating a sound that seemed to resonate through the hulls of every vessel in the area. The effect on the Ravagers was immediate and profound. 47 of the galaxy's most dangerous predators began purring in harmony, creating a sound that was simultaneously terrifying and oddly soothing. "Sir," the flagship's tactical officer reported, "our weapon systems are showing multiple malfunctions. The Ravagers appear to be disabling our combat capabilities." "What do you mean disabling?" "They're carefully removing key components from our weapon arrays. It's like they're performing surgery on our ships." Admiral Thorn looked at his tactical display, where his fleet was being systematically and efficiently disarmed by creatures that were now more interested in creating a safe space for cat observation than in following military orders. "This is not how wars are supposed to work," he said to no one in particular. "Sir," his communication officer said, "we're receiving a transmission from the civilian vessel." "Put it through." Vex's face appeared on the screen, with Murphy visible on his shoulder and Razor lurking in the background like a protective shadow. "Admiral," Vex said, "I think we need to talk." "About what?" "About the fact that you just lost an entire fleet to a cat, and about what that means for your plans to commit genocide against human colonies." Thorn's face went pale. "How do you know about that?" "Because Razor downloaded your entire database during our escape," Vex replied. "Every classified file, every operational plan, every dirty little secret the hegemony has been hiding. And now we're broadcasting it to every news service in the galaxy. That's classified information." "Not anymore. The whole galaxy is about to learn what you were planning to do with your Ravager army." Admiral Thorn looked around his bridge, where his officers were staring at him with the kind of expression that suggested they were rapidly reassessing their career choices. "You can't do this," he said. "Actually, we can," Vex replied. "Because your ultimate weapons have decided they'd rather be pet therapy specialists than genocide tools. And frankly, I think they're making the right choice." Murphy, as if to emphasize this point, began kneading Vex's shoulder with the kind of satisfied purring that suggested he was pleased with how the situation was developing. "What do you want?" Thorn asked. "Unconditional surrender would be nice," Vex said, "along with a formal apology to every human colony you were planning to destroy, and maybe some sort of reparations package. Oh, and a lifetime supply of cat food. Murphy's got expensive tastes." "This is blackmail." "This is justice," Vex corrected. "The universe just got a lesson in what happens when you underestimate the power of small fuzzy creatures." Admiral Thorn looked at his tactical display, where his fleet was now completely disarmed and his Ravagers were apparently building some sort of elaborate structure in space that looked suspiciously like a giant cat playground. "Fine," he said. "You win." "Excellent," Vex replied. "Razor, would you like to accept the Admiral's surrender on behalf of Murphy?" Razor stepped forward, gently picked up Murphy, and held him up to the communication screen. Murphy looked at Admiral Thorne with the kind of expression that suggested he was graciously accepting tribute from a defeated enemy. "The cat accepts your surrender," Vex translated. 6 months later, the galaxy had settled into what historians would later call the post-cat paradigm, a period of unprecedented peace that nobody had seen coming, and that most people still didn't quite believe was real. The Ravager Rehabilitation Program had become the most successful interspecies adoption initiative in galactic history. Former killing machines were now working as everything from construction workers to therapy animals, with the only requirement being that they each get paired with a companion animal from their chosen species. Captain Vex Corin, who had gone from failed smuggler to galactic hero in the span of a week, was now running a non-profit organization called Predators and Pets from an office on New Geneva Station. The irony of operating out of a former military facility wasn't lost on him, but the rent was cheap and the location came with built-in security systems that the Ravagers had helpfully modified to dispense treats on command. "Status report," Vex said, looking up from his desk where Murphy was conducting his daily inspection of the morning's paperwork. Dr. Kess Reynard, who had been pardoned for her crimes and was now the program's chief behavioral specialist, consulted her tablet. "We've successfully placed 43 Ravagers in permanent homes. The remaining 4 are still in training, but they're showing excellent progress." "And the therapy program?" "Beyond our wildest expectations. Ravager 7 has been working with trauma victims on Kepler Prime, and the results are remarkable. Apparently, being gently held by something that could theoretically crush you but chooses not to has significant therapeutic benefits." "And Admiral Thorne?" "Still in minimum security prison, still being provided with mandatory therapy sessions by a Ravager named Cuddles who has developed an unhealthy obsession with romance novels. The prison psychiatrist says it's the most effective rehabilitation program they've ever seen." Vex nodded, making notes on his tablet. The transformation of the galaxy's most dangerous military leader into someone who spent his days discussing the emotional complexities of fictional relationships with a reformed bioweapon was one of the program's more unexpected success stories. "What about the hegemony's response to the leaked files?" "Complete political collapse," Dr. Reynard reported with satisfaction. "Turns out that revealing plans for galactic genocide is bad for approval ratings. The new government is actually funding our program as part of their commitment to interspecies cooperation." "Speaking of which," Vex said, "how's the research going?" Dr. Reynard's expression grew thoughtful. "That's the interesting part. The more I study the bonding patterns between Ravagers and their companion animals, the more I realize that we might have stumbled onto something significant." "How significant?" "Well, it turns out that cats aren't actually native to Earth." Vex looked up from his paperwork. "What do you mean?" "I mean, cats are an ancient galactic species that has been subtly influencing civilizations for millennia. They're basically sleeper agents for the most successful conquest in galactic history." "You're saying Murphy is an alien?" Murphy, who had been listening to this conversation with the kind of casual interest that cats show when humans are discussing matters of cosmic importance, looked up from his inspection of Vex's pen and made a sound that might have been agreement. "Not just Murphy," Dr. Reynard continued. "All cats. They've been systematically infiltrating species across the galaxy, turning potential threats into devoted servants through strategic deployment of purring and adorable behavior." "That's ridiculous," Vex said. Murphy fixed him with the kind of stare that suggested he was reconsidering Vex's standing in the household hierarchy. "Is it?" Dr. Reynard asked. "Think about it. Cats show up on a planet, convince the dominant species to feed them, shelter them, and clean up after them, all while providing minimal services in return. They turn apex predators into purring companions and transform military weapons into therapy tools. If that's not conquest, I don't know what is." Vex looked at Murphy, who was now sitting in his classic loaf position, tail curled around his paws, watching the conversation with the kind of satisfied expression that suggested he was pleased with how his plans were developing. So what you're telling me is that Murphy isn't just a cat. He's basically a galactic overlord who's been manipulating me for 3 years. Manipulating is such a harsh word, Dr. Reynard said. I prefer to think of it as strategic relationship management. Through the office window, they could see the station's main plaza, where a group of ravagers were playing with their assigned companion animals under the watchful supervision of their human handlers. The scene looked like something from a children's book, if children's books typically featured 8-foot bioweapons learning to play fetch. You know what the really scary part is? Vex said. Vex said. What? What? It's working. The galaxy is more peaceful now than it's been in centuries. Crime rates are down, interspecies conflicts have virtually disappeared, and everyone's too busy taking care of their companion animals to start wars. The great cat conquest, Dr. Reynard mused. They didn't need weapons or armies. They just needed to be adorable and slightly judgmental. Murphy made a sound that was definitely agreement this time. Well, Vex said, reaching over to scratch Murphy's head as conquests go, this one's not too bad. At least our new overlords are fluffy. Murphy began purring, a sound that was quickly joined by the harmonious purring of 43 former bioweapons who had discovered that the best way to be a perfect predator was to dedicate your life to making small fuzzy creatures happy. Outside, Razor could be seen leading a group of young ravagers through what appeared to be a training exercise in proper cat petting techniques. The sight of the galaxy's most dangerous creatures learning to give belly rubs with appropriate gentleness was probably the most absurd thing Vex had ever witnessed. I still can't believe this all started because I crashed into a military station while trying to fence stolen protein bars, Vex said. The universe has a sense of humor, Dr. Reynard replied. It just took a cat to reveal it. Murphy, having completed his inspection of the morning's paperwork and finding it adequately supervised, settled down for his mid-morning nap. As he drifted off to sleep, he was undoubtedly dreaming of the galactic empire he had accidentally conquered through the simple application of cat logic. If you want something done right, train a human to do it for you. And if the human happens to have access to bioweapons, well, that just makes the conquest more efficient.